To save her brother, she agreed. But their first night changed everything. The air in Eduardo Varela's office was colder than Camila had expected. It wasn't just the temperature. It was him. The towering glass windows behind his desk framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline, lights glittering like scattered diamonds against the dark horizon. But Camila Torres barely noticed. Her mind was spinning, her pulse racing as she sat across from the man who held her family's fate in his hands. Eduardo Varela. The name alone sent shivers down her spine. CEO of Varela Global, ruthless, calculating, untouchable. And now the only person who could save her brother. Her fingers clenched into fists in her lap, nails digging into her palms. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice trembling, almost lost in the cavernous silence of the room. Across the desk, Eduardo leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. His piercing gray eyes studied her like a predator sizing up its prey. "I don't make jokes when it comes to business, Miss Torres." Camila swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold his gaze. Diego, her older brother, her only family, had made a reckless investment, trusting the wrong people. Now he was drowning in millions of dollars in debt, money he could never repay. If she didn't act fast, the creditors would come for him, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Eduardo steepled his fingers, watching her struggle with the decision he'd so casually thrown into her lap. He didn't seem bothered by her distress. If anything, he looked almost bored. "You're saying," she began, her voice shaking, "if I agree to marry you, you'll erase Diego's debt?" He inclined his head slightly, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's the offer." "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. His smile widened, cold and calculated. "Then your brother's creditors will come for him. And we both know what happens to men who owe money they can't pay." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a proposal, it was a cage, dressed up in expensive suits and legal documents. She squared her shoulders, forcing steel into her voice. "So that's it. You want a wife, and I just happen to be the unfortunate one caught in your web?" Eduardo remained eerily calm. "I need a wife for exactly 1 year, that's all." Her mind raced. 1 year, 12 months of being tied to a man she didn't trust, didn't even like. But the alternative, losing Diego forever, was unthinkable. With trembling hands, Camila reached for the contract in front of her and signed away her freedom. The wedding happened 3 days later. There was no excitement, no nervous anticipation, only business. The ceremony was flawlessly orchestrated, with expensive floral arrangements, a 5-star venue, and an exclusive guest list. Yet it was devoid of warmth, like a scene from a movie where no one cared about the actors on screen. Camila walked down the aisle in an elegant white gown, every step feeling heavier than the last. Her heart pounded, not with joy, but with the crushing weight of her decision. At the end of the aisle stood Eduardo, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo. His expression was unreadable, his gaze distant. He didn't look at her with love or even curiosity. When the officiant asked if he took her as his wife, his response was emotionless. "I do." It was over in minutes. The reception was equally sterile. A room full of powerful people whispered behind their champagne glasses, speculating about why the untouchable Eduardo Varela had suddenly taken a wife. The media had a field day. Camila Torres, gold digger, or the luckiest woman alive. She didn't care what they thought. Not when she caught sight of Diego standing at the back of the room, tears streaming down his face. He gave her a small, grateful nod, and for a moment, she reminded herself why she had done this. Diego was safe. That was all that mattered. By the time they arrived at Eduardo's massive penthouse, Camila's body was exhausted, but her mind was wide awake. This was it. their wedding night. She stood in the center of the luxurious bedroom, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to face him. Eduardo loosened his tie, his movements slow and deliberate. Without looking at her, he said flatly, "I'll be sleeping in the guest room." Camilla blinked, stunned. "What?" He finally met her gaze, his eyes void of any warmth. "You didn't think this was a real marriage, did you?" Something inside her clenched. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I don't know what I expected." Eduardo exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple, as if the entire conversation exhausted him. "This is a contract, Camilla. You're my wife on paper, nothing more." Her chest tightened, but she refused to show weakness. Lifting her chin, she shot back. "Then why did you marry me at all?" His jaw tensed. For a moment, she thought he might soften, might give her some semblance of humanity. Instead, he simply said, "Because I needed to." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving her alone in a room that suddenly felt too big, too empty. For the first time since signing the contract, Camilla felt the full weight of what she had agreed to. She was a wife without a husband, and this was only the beginning. From the moment she stepped into Eduardo Varela's world, Camila Torres realized just how much of a business transaction this marriage truly was. Her days were scheduled down to the minute. Appearances at corporate events, carefully curated public outings, and a never-ending parade of formal galas. But through it all, Eduardo never touched her, never even looked at her longer than necessary. The first event they attended together was a black-tie charity gala. Camila had spent hours getting ready, her makeup flawless, her gown hugging her figure perfectly. She had expected at least a nod of acknowledgement when Eduardo saw her. Instead, he barely glanced at her before offering his arm, his grip impersonal. When they arrived at the event, he leaned in, his voice a low whisper against her ear. "Smile. Look happy. That's all you need to do." So she did. She played her part perfectly, smiling at the right moments, answering polite questions, pretending to be the devoted wife of a powerful man. But Eduardo kept his distance. Even when reporters tried to get a romantic shot of them, he simply placed a hand on the small of her back. Nothing more. As the night went on, Camilla realized this was her new reality, a marriage where she was present but invisible. The next morning, a neatly organized folder appeared on the dining table, delivered by Eduardo's assistant. Inside were the rules. Camilla read them with growing disbelief. No interference in his personal life. No expectations of affection. No discussions about the past or the future. After 1 year, she would leave. No exceptions. She clenched the papers, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. She had officially signed up for a year-long prison sentence. Life with Eduardo was a constant push and pull. He wasn't just cold, he was downright infuriating. Every morning he would leave for work without a word, barely acknowledging her presence. Every evening he would return late, head straight to his office, and shut the door. At first, Camila tried to ignore it, tried to live like a ghost in his home. But she wasn't built to be silent. One night, after yet another awkward dinner where Eduardo had barely spoken a full sentence to her, she'd had enough. She followed him into his office, arms crossed. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. Eduardo didn't even look up from his laptop. "Be more specific." She gestured around them. "This entire situation. You don't talk to me, you don't even look at me unless we're in public." He exhaled sharply, finally meeting her gaze. "We have a deal, Camilla." She scoffed. "A deal doesn't mean you have to act like I don't exist." His jaw tightened. "And what do you expect? For me to pretend we're in love?" "No," she shot back. "But I expect basic human decency." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Eduardo looked uncertain, as if he hadn't anticipated that she would fight back. He sighed, rubbing his temple. Go to bed, Camilla. She narrowed her eyes. You don't get to dismiss me like one of your employees. His eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous in them. This marriage is a contract, Camilla, nothing more. The sooner you accept that, the easier it will be. She held his gaze, refusing to back down. You might be fine living in a loveless marriage, but I won't let you treat me like I don't exist. For the first time, Eduardo had no response, and as she turned and walked away, he realized something unsettling. He had underestimated her. The fever hit Camilla out of nowhere. One moment she was going about her day as usual, dealing with the cold indifference of her husband and pretending their marriage wasn't just a business transaction. The next, she was curled up in bed, shivering violently, her entire body aching. She didn't call for help. She knew Eduardo didn't care. He barely acknowledged her existence unless it was for the sake of the media. But late that night, through the haze of her fever, she felt a cool hand press against her forehead. A deep voice, unexpectedly soft, murmured, "Damn, Camilla." She forced her eyes open, her vision blurry. But even in the dim light, she recognized Eduardo's face above hers. His brows were furrowed, his usually emotionless expression replaced with something unfamiliar, worry. Or was she imagining it? "Are you checking on me?" she whispered hoarsely. He hesitated, then replied, his tone clipped, but quieter than usual. "Don't make this into something it's not. I'm here because it's my responsibility." But as he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and gently pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, Camilla couldn't help but wonder, was there more beneath his icy exterior? He sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed, pressing a damp cloth to her burning skin. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well." A weak laugh escaped Camilla's lips. "Would you have cared?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he carefully adjusted the covers around her, making sure she was warm. His touch was gentle, precise, so unlike the cold businessman she had come to know. In her fevered state, Camilla almost let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Eduardo Varela than the ruthless CEO who had bought her into this marriage. But by the time morning came, he was gone. When she woke up alone in the massive bed, she convinced herself it had all been a dream. The gala was extravagant, a gathering of New York's wealthiest elite. Camilla had grown used to these events, putting on a perfect smile and standing beside Eduardo like a well-trained accessory. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was because of what had happened the night before, because she had seen a glimpse of something real in him, and now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Or maybe it was because of the man currently leaning a little too close to her, his expensive cologne invading her senses. Richard Davenport, a well-known investor with a reputation for charming women just for sport, smirked as he spoke. "You're far too stunning to be ignored the way Varela ignores you." Camilla forced a polite smile, stepping back slightly. "I think you're mistaken." "Oh, am I?" Richard tilted his head, his hand grazing hers. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like your husband doesn't appreciate what he has." Before Camilla could respond, a firm hand wrapped around her wrist, yanking her backward. She barely had time to react before Eduardo's towering frame positioned itself between her and Richard. His grip was possessive, his jaw clenched tight. The entire ballroom seemed to freeze. Eduardo's voice was deceptively calm, but Camilla could feel the rage simmering beneath it. "She's not available for conversation, Davenport." Richard chuckled, completely unfazed. "Ah, there he is. The infamous Eduardo Varela. I was starting to think you didn't care what your wife did." Eduardo's hold on Camilla tightened. For just a second. Then, without another word, he turned and led her out of the ballroom. Camila barely kept up with his long strides as he pulled her onto the empty terrace. The cool night air hit her flushed skin, but it did nothing to cool the storm in Eduardo's eyes. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. She ripped her wrist from his grasp, her own eyes flashing. "Excuse me? You were flirting with him?" She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, now you care. That's interesting, considering you spent this entire marriage pretending I don't exist." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're my wife, Camilla." "Oh, am I?" she shot back. "Because most of the time, you treat me like an inconvenience." His nostrils flared, and before she could say another word, he closed the distance between them in one swift motion, and then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was possessive, desperate. A battle of control. Camilla's mind screamed at her to push him away, to remind him that this wasn't real. But her traitorous body responded before she could stop it. Her fingers curled into his tuxedo, her lips parting against his. Her entire world tilted on its axis. But just as quickly as it began, Eduardo pulled away. His breathing was heavy, his hands still gripping her arms as if he wasn't sure whether to let go or hold on tighter. For a brief moment, his mask slipped, and she saw it, the same desire, the same fear, the same confusion that she felt. But then his wall slammed back into place. "This was a mistake," he muttered, releasing her abruptly. Camilla's heart plummeted, and as he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone on the terrace, she realized something that terrified her more than anything else. She had fallen for him, and he was never going to let himself love her back. The days after the kiss were agonizing. Eduardo returned to his usual distant self, if anything. He was even colder than before. Camilla should have expected it, after all. This was a man who thrived on control, who refused to let anyone see the cracks in his armor. But what she hadn't anticipated was how much it would hurt. Every glance, every dismissive comment, every moment of silence between them felt heavier now. She tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that this was just a business arrangement. But the truth was undeniable. She had let herself feel something for him, and now she was paying the price. One evening, as she sat alone in the penthouse's sprawling living room, she noticed something strange. A small envelope had been left on the coffee table, addressed to her in elegant handwriting. Inside was an invitation to a private art exhibition at one of the city's most exclusive galleries. The note read, "For appearances, of course. Be ready by 7. It was signed simply, Evie. Camilla stared at the invitation, her heart pounding. Was this another calculated move? Or was there something more behind it? As she prepared for the evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that this night might change everything or destroy her completely. She should have known better, but that didn't stop the ache in her chest every time Eduardo Varela avoided her gaze. She tried to pretend it didn't matter, that she hadn't spent countless nights thinking about the way he had kissed her, that she hadn't hoped, just for a second, that maybe he felt something too. But it was useless, because every time he spoke to her, his words were clipped, controlled, because he refused to acknowledge what had happened between them, because he was pretending it hadn't meant anything, and that hurt more than anything else. One evening, as she lay awake in their enormous empty bed staring at the ceiling, she let herself whisper the truth she had been avoiding. "I love him." The words felt like a curse because she knew, no matter how much she loved him, Eduardo Varela would never love her back. Eduardo Varela had always believed that love was just another weakness. He had built his life around control over his business, his image, his emotions. For years, that control had been unshakable. Until her. until Camila Torres. Ever since that night on the terrace when he had kissed her, truly kissed her, he hadn't been able to think straight. She was getting under his skin in ways he never expected. He couldn't stop watching her, finding himself seeking her out even when he told himself not to. And that terrified him. Because he knew where love led. He had seen it firsthand. His mother sobbing late into the night, his father leaving without looking back. Love was a trap, a lie that only ended in pain. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pushed her away. He stopped speaking to her unless absolutely necessary. He worked longer hours, leaving early and coming home late. When he was home, he barely looked at her. And when she walked into a room, he walked out. But none of it helped, because no matter how much distance he put between them, she was always there, in his thoughts, in the way his bed felt emptier than ever, in the way his heart clenched every time he saw the sadness in her eyes. But he couldn't let himself feel, because if he did, if he let himself love her, he would be vulnerable. And Eduardo Varela didn't do vulnerability. Camila tried. God, she tried. She told herself that Eduardo's distance didn't hurt, that she could endure his coldness, that maybe, just maybe, he would come around. But as the days turned into weeks, as the silence between them grew heavier, she realized the truth. He wasn't just avoiding her, he was rejecting her. And she couldn't do it anymore. One evening, she sat alone in their bedroom, staring at the contract she had signed all those months ago. 1 year, that was the deal. But why wait? Why keep putting herself through this pain when she already knew how this would end? Taking a shaky breath, she reached for her suitcase. She was leaving. Not because she wanted to, but because staying would destroy her. She found Eduardo in his office, working late as usual. When she stepped inside, he didn't even look up. That hurt more than it should have. "I want out," she said quietly. The words made his hand still over the keyboard. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, his expression carefully blank. Too blank. "What?" Camila forced herself to stay strong. "I'm leaving. I'm ending the contract early." Something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Fine," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Fine." That was all he had to say. No protest, no questions, no hesitation. Just, fine. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. "I'll have my things packed by morning." For a moment, she thought, hoped, that he would say something, that he would ask her to stay. But he just nodded, looking back at his laptop like she was just another business deal closing early. Her heart shattered. Without another word, she turned and walked away. And Eduardo? He watched her go, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. But he didn't stop her. Because he had convinced himself this was what he wanted. Eduardo Varela had built his entire life around control. But now, sitting alone in his office, staring blankly at a contract he had no interest in reading, he realized he had lost it. It had been 2 weeks since Camila left, 14 days, 336 hours, and not a single one of them had passed without her haunting him. At first he told himself nothing had changed, that his life was exactly as it had been before she walked into it, that her absence didn't matter. But that was a lie. Because the penthouse felt too empty. Because he kept turning to speak to her, only to remember she wasn't there. Because every time he saw something that reminded him of her, a book she had left on the coffee table, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in their bedroom, his chest ached in a way he didn't understand. And then one evening, as he sat at his desk, drowning in the silence, it hit him. He loved her. He had loved her for a long time, but he had been too much of a coward to admit it. And now she was gone, and he had no one to blame but himself. Finding Camila wasn't difficult. She had gone back to her old life, working at a small publishing house, living in a modest apartment. What was difficult was figuring out how to face her, how to undo the damage. As Eduardo stood outside her building, his heart pounding, he realized something. This wasn't just about fixing what he had broken. This was about proving, to her and to himself, that he was capable of more than control, that he could be the man she deserved. But first, he had to convince her to listen. He had caused so much pain, but then fate intervened. That night she was at a charity gala, one she had agreed to attend before their marriage ended. Eduardo Varela didn't hesitate. He walked into that ballroom with one purpose: to win her back. The moment he saw her, his breath caught. She was standing across the room, dressed in a deep emerald green gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders like waves of silk. She looked breathtaking, but she wasn't smiling. And when her gaze met his, her expression turned to shock. A hush fell over the crowd as Eduardo strode toward her, stopping just a few feet away. Camila's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I was wrong," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Her eyes widened. "Eduardo!" But he didn't let her finish. "I was wrong to push you away. I was wrong to let you leave." The room was completely silent now. All eyes were on them. He took another step closer, his voice raw and real. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of loving you. Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of losing control." Her breath hitched, but she didn't look away. "But then I realized something," he continued. He reached for her hand, his grip firm yet desperate. "I'm more afraid of living without you." A gasp rippled through the room. Tears welled in Camila's eyes. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I love you, and I don't care about control anymore. I just care about you." A single tear slipped down her cheek, and then she smiled. For weeks, Camila had convinced herself this was over, that Eduardo would never change, that he had never loved her. But standing here, looking into his eyes, she knew he meant it. This was real. She let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her tears. "You are such an idiot." A grin tugged at his lips. "Yeah, but I'm your idiot." She exhaled, then whispered the words that had been sitting in her heart for far too long. "I love you too." Before he could say another word, she threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. And for the first time in his life, Eduardo Varela knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. A new beginning. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting golden light through the windows of the penthouse. But this time it wasn't cold and empty. This time it was home. Camila stood on the balcony, a warm breeze brushing against her skin. She never imagined she would be back here, at least not like this. Not as Eduardo's real wife, not as the woman he loved. She heard footsteps behind her, and then a familiar warmth as strong arms wrapped around her waist. Eduardo pressed a soft kiss to the side of her neck. "What are you thinking about?" She smiled, leaning into him. "About how different things feel now." He turned her around to face him, his hands resting on her hips, his gaze softer than she had ever seen before. "Good different?" he asked. She reached up, brushing her fingers along his jaw. "The best kind of different." He exhaled, then slowly dropped to one knee. Camila's breath caught. She hadn't expected this, not tonight, not like this. But as she looked down at the man who had once been so closed off, so afraid of love, now kneeling before her with his heart completely open, She realized there was no moment more perfect than this one. Eduardo pulled out a small velvet box, flipping it open to reveal a stunning diamond ring. "I asked you to marry me once before," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I did it for the wrong reasons." Her heart pounded. "This time," he continued, "there's no contract, no conditions, just you and me. Because I love you, Camilla, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Tears welled in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. Then with a teary laugh, she said it again. "Yes, Eduardo." He slid the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. She kissed him, slow and deep, knowing that this time this was real. 1 year later, laughter filled the penthouse. But it wasn't from them. It was from the tiny baby cradled in Eduardo Varela's arms. Camila watched from the couch, her heart melting at the sight of her husband, her once cold, emotionless husband, gently rocking their newborn daughter. "She looks just like you," Eduardo murmured, brushing his fingers over the baby's soft cheek. Camila smiled. "And she already has you wrapped around her little finger." He glanced at her, a slow, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Just like her mother." She reached over, lacing their fingers together. "You don't regret anything, do you?" He shook his head, his gaze never leaving hers. "Not for a second." And as he leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, Camilla knew this was what love was meant to be. A choice, a home, a family. And she wouldn't change a thing. The journey of love. Camilla never expected that signing a marriage contract would lead her to the greatest love of her life. And Eduardo. He never thought he was capable of love until he almost lost it. Their journey wasn't perfect. It was cold, complicated, and filled with mistakes. But love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing someone, even when it's difficult. 1 year later, they stood together, not because of contract, not because of obligation, but because they wanted to. Because they had built something real. And as Eduardo held their newborn daughter in his arms, he finally understood. Love wasn't a weakness. It was the strongest thing he had ever known. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Timelenz Stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional, heartwarming tale. Because sometimes the most unexpected stories lead to the most unforgettable love doesn't always start perfectly, but the best ones always find a way. What if the person who challenges you the most is also the one who changes you forever? Love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway. So take a chance on love. You might just discover your own happily ever after.